Leaders don't cling because they're stubborn. They cling because they're scared of losing what once made them strong. But here's the truth, and I want to offer it gently. What once made you effective can quietly become now what holds you back, especially in the messy middle of change. Clinging isn't resistance, it's protection. And it makes perfect sense until it doesn't. Welcome back to the Leadership Longevity Podcast. I'm Elizabeth Hughes, and after grounding ourselves in the ecosystem, the architecture that holds your internal and external conditions, we're now stepping into the survival driver 2, the influence distortion pattern. If the survivor driver 1 was about your capacity, survivor driver 2 is about your influence, how you respond, adapt, and lead in a world that refuses to stay still. And here's the part that matters. Survival driver 2 distorts your influence, not by draining your energy, but by narrowing your adaptability. When the external layer of your ecosystem becomes unstable, the relationships, expectations, pace, pressure, and conditions around you, your leadership begins to distort in predictable ways. You grip, which is myth 5, you rush, myth 6, and you rely on authority instead of presence in myth 7. So these aren't mindset issues, they're ecosystem responses. And we begin with one of the most universal leadership myths, the myth of holding on. The belief that strength comes from clinging to what worked before, even when everything around you is shifting. Inside the leadership longevity ecosystem, this myth sits within survival driver 2, the influence distortion pattern. Holding on is a distortion of influence, the belief that stability comes from sameness, even when the ecosystem around you is evolving. And here's the part that most leaders never see. When you grip what once worked, you don't just limit your own adaptability, you shape the conditions others must adapt inside as well. So influence is always inherited, and the patterns you grip today become the conditions the next layer of leadership inherits tomorrow. The myth of holding on says, if it worked before, it should work now. It tells you that consistency equals competence, sameness equals stability. Repeating what worked is safer than trying what might not. Your past success is a better guide to the future. But here's the deeper truth. Clinging feels like strength, but it's actually a form of fear. Fear of losing control, fear of losing identity, and fear of losing what once made you credible, capable, and respected. And fear becomes even stronger when you're already in the middle of change. Here's the lived experience of a leader in transition. You've made changes, you've updated systems, you've shifted strategy, you've evolved your language, but underneath the surface, you're still reaching for the old tools. You're still relying on the old familiar habits, you're still defaulting to what once worked, not because you're resisting change, but because you're in it and in the middle of change. The past feels like an anchor. The future feels like a fog, and the present feels like a tightrope. This is the messy middle, where you're holding on and letting go all at the same time. And this is the moment where your external layer becomes unstable, when your influence is shaped more by fear than by responsiveness. This myth is seductive because it feels responsible. It feels wise. It feels grounded. It feels like protecting what you've already earned, and the organizations reinforce it too, right? Especially mid-change. Let's not lose what made us great. We need to honor our legacy, and we can't forget where we came from. But here's the quiet truth. What feels safe is often what keeps us tangled. Here's an organization you've met versions of it before. It has a hallway unofficially known as the Museum of Former Successes, except now the museum is under construction, or should I say renovation. Half the hallway is still intact. The framed awards from 2003, the laminated 5-step excellence model, the photos from the offsite where everyone wore matching polo shirts. The other half is covered in drop sheets. Some frames have been taken down, some are leaning against the wall, waiting for a decision. A new innovation wall is being installed, though no one is quite sure what will go on it yet. Every leader is still walked down the hallway as part of their induction, but now the script has changed. This, they're told, is who we were, and this is who we're trying to become. So one morning then, the executive team gathers to discuss a challenge that is undeniably modern. Shifting customer expectations, new technology, a pace that refuses to slow. And the conversation reflects the hallway. Half the room reaches for the old playbook and the other half reaches for the new one. Everyone is trying to adapt, just not in the same direction or at the same speed. The future is calling, the past is tugging, and the organisation is standing in the middle, holding both ends of the rope. No villain, no resistance, just a system in transition, gripping that to what once was what made it strong, while trying to grow into what it needs to be next. And if you're honest, you might feel this in yourself too. The part of you that's reaching for the familiar and the part of you that's stretching toward the future and the part of you just caught in between. That tension isn't a flaw, it's the shape of adaptation. And that's the emotional truth of myth 5. Adaptation isn't blocked by the past, it's just tangled up in it. So here's where the science becomes grounding, and I want to offer it with clarity and care. So predictive processing, the brain loves the familiar. So your brain is a prediction machine. It prefers what it already knows because it reduces cognitive load. Familiar equals safe, unfamiliar equals threat. So when leaders cling to what worked before, it's not stubbornness, it's just neurobiology. Secondly, there's the identity threat, where letting go feels like losing yourself. So leaders cling to the strengths that built them, the habits that defined them, in the roles that validated them, the strategies that made them successful. Because letting go feels like losing identity. So this isn't resistance, it's eco-preservation, the brain protecting itself, particularly after all those years that you've actually spent building that identity. And thirdly, of course, there's ecological succession. The fact that systems must evolve or they become fragile. In ecology, this is called succession, the natural evolution of an ecosystem over time. It's what thrives in one stage cannot thrive in the next. And the ecosystems that resist transition become fragile. Leaders and organisations, and often countries, are no different. So here's the deeper truth, and I want to offer it gently. Clinging is not strength, it's fear, wearing armour. And the moment you stop gripping the past, your influence expands, because adaptability isn't about abandoning who you were, it's about evolving who you are, especially in a messy middle. Inside the ecosystem, holding on fractures your external layer, collapsing your adaptability into rigidity and narrowing your influence when responsiveness is actually required. And because the external layer is rational, your rigidity becomes relational too. Inside the ecosystem, holding on fractures your external layer, collapsing adaptability into rigidity and narrowing your influence when responsiveness is required. And because the external layer is relational, your rigidity becomes relational too. People begin to mirror the very patterns you were trying to outgrow. So letting go is not losing control. It's actually gaining capacity. Adaptability is not instability, it's intelligence. Flexibility is not weakness, it's influence. Your past success is a foundation, not a cage. And the moment you loosen your grip, your leadership begins to move again. So this week, choose one habit, one approach, or one belief you've been gripping. And as your tiny experiment, loosen your hold by 10%. What does loosening by 10% look like? If you normally jump in immediately, wait one extra beat. If you usually insist on the old way, allow one alternative. If you tend to control the whole process, hand over one small piece. If you cling to certainty, ask one curious question instead of giving an answer. If you default to the familiar, try a micro variation, a slightly different route, phasing or approach. Not a reinvention, not a leap, just a loosening, a tiny release of pressure. This is how adaptability begins, not by letting go all at once, although I have tried that on more than one occasion, but by letting go just enough to create movement. Then perhaps consider the reflective question. Where am I holding on and letting go at the same time? And what is the tension trying to teach me? Let it be honest. Let it be revealing. Let it be liberating. And then finally, for our ecosystem practice, once a week ask, what does this moment require of the next version of me? This is how leaders evolve, not through reinvention, but through continuous release. So strength isn't holding on. Strength is knowing when to let go. Releasing the myth of holding on feels like loosening a grip you didn't realize had tightened. It's the moment you understand that strength isn't clinging, it's in your willingness to evolve. It feels like fresh air entering your leadership, your perspective widening and your influence expanding, because you're no longer anchored to what once worked. It's spacious, adaptive, and quietly confident, the kind of leadership that moves with the moment rather than resisting it. So, if myth 5 is the myth of gripping, myth 6 is the myth of rushing. Because once you stop clinging to the past, you start to see the pace you've been inheriting from the system around you. You start to notice how quickly you move to fill the space, how fast you respond to pressure, how instinctively you accelerate when uncertainty arises. In our next episode, we explore the myth of speed, the belief that reacting fast equals effectiveness. This is the second distortion of influence, and it reveals a truth many leaders feel but rarely name. Sometimes the rush isn't momentum. It's fear in motion. I'll meet you there.